museum objects are important to study and to just have an encounter with. It can be less formal than studying. I think when you go to a museum, you can wander around however you want to. You can pause and look at whatever you'd like to and whatever you connect with. And I think it's valuable to do that because you never really know where you might find inspiration from, in your life and your work. You never can really tell what you might find a connection with. And more than that, once you start looking more closely at an object, you can really learn a lot from it in a lot of different directions. You might learn specific information about it that you're interested in. Well, how is something like that made? How do they make the materials to make something like that? And then you realize how much work goes into even starting to make something like a basket like we see here. And then you can learn about different values that you share with people really far away. So in Alaska, with the Tlingit people, it's important, as well as with other Alaska Native groups, to sustainably harvest from the land and the seas, because your community relies upon what the land and the sea provides. And so when you look at pieces that very closely, for example, you might look at a harpoon and you might see that it's beautifully made, that the finger rest that's used to help guide the harpoon when you throw it might have a seal head, might be carved into a seal head instead of being plain. And part of the cultural values there are that not only are you honoring the animals by making something beautiful that you're encountering them with, but that if you make something really beautiful, the animal's more likely to give itself to you because you've honored that animal. And there are historic ceremonies and celebrations where that relationship with animals is honored, and that's been a very important part of traditions in Alaska and into the present day. Later on, we'll look at some dance fans, and that's an example of something that would be used at a celebration hundreds of years ago, and they're still used today. It might be something that you can buy in a tourist shop in Anchorage, but they're also used. They're in that aspect, they're an artistic expression, a piece of work an artist sells to make a living, but at the same time, those kind of dance fans would be used in their own community in celebrations today. And I also think that when you look closely at objects, you can really start to appreciate the technology and science behind them, and the amount of thought and energy that went into developing how very specific they are. Because it wasn't easy to make a life in certain places in Alaska, and a lot of places in Alaska. So you had to be very good at what you did. You had to make a very, very good parka. You had to make boots that performed excellently. You had to build kayaks that would work without question and work really well and work very accurately when you were out hunting. And then when you start to think about some of these things, at the Hood Museum, they're very lucky to have a full-size kayak. They have gut parkas, they have darts, harpoons, all the sorts of things that people would have used in the past, and some of those things we still use today. I bet a lot of people watching this have been kayaking or want to go kayaking. Well, those were technologies just like waterproof boots, some of which you have in the collection here, that were developed by Alaska Natives or Canadian Inuits and that are still used today. And when you start looking closely at things like that, there's just a wealth of knowledge there, the math and the science and the sustainable taking of resources, all of that's embedded in these objects. So one small, maybe even simple looking object has a lot of stories to tell, a lot of knowledge to impart, and a lot of ways in which you can learn from them. In looking at the Hood Museum collection, I think I was drawn to two kinds of objects. And one kind of object is subsistence-related objects, so things like hunting and fishing. And I think part of that is that I really appreciate the technology and the study that went behind making these very specific to the kind of animal being hunted and the way in which someone was hunting, so hunting on land or hunting at sea. Or are they hunting for a walrus? Are they hunting for a sea otter? All of the equipment used for that is very different. And later on, we'll look at a sukpiat kayak, and we'll be able to see some examples of that. So those really intrigue me because I just always appreciate the detailed knowledge and the depth of knowledge that conveys, because people were studying hunting for hundreds, thousands of years in order to reach the point of making something that worked that well. And still today, people practice subsistence in Alaska, and we use that term somewhat differently than hunting, because subsistence really implies that you're relying upon that as a food source, and that you're utilizing that resource in a way that's sustainable, because you need to have it there year after year, generation after generation. So, you know, I don't go out hunting sea mammals by a kayak, but I do go out dip netting. A friend of mine is Alaska Native, and she has a fish camp that she's been inviting me to. And, you know, the first year I just watched. I didn't do anything except cook some food. And the next year I cooked some food and cleaned some fish. And then the year after that I actually fished. And in doing that, not only was I trying not to make a fool of myself, because I wouldn't have known what I was doing, but I was also trying to follow a native way of learning. And that is by watching and by doing and by someone helping you do that well. And so it's having that subsistence way of life really reminds you that you have a connection with nature, you have a connection with the land, the place that you come from, and the more knowledgeable that you are about that, the better you do living there, and the greater appreciation you have of what is there, and hopefully the more likely you are to care about being a caretaker for land and those resources, and to make decisions for the long term, not the short term. And that's a challenge in Alaska, because a lot of income in Alaska is based on extracting resources. And that's still a challenge that we face today of how to do that and what choices to do and not to do. And I think when you look at historic pieces in museum collections, the sort of things that have been used and made for hundreds and thousands of years, it makes you realize that if we want to be in this place that long, we have to follow that same practice of doing things sustainably, respectfully. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that in today's world and today's economy and you know, capitalistic-based way of looking at the world, which is very different from the Alaska Native way of looking at the world. The second area of the collection that intrigued me were things that you didn't know very much about. A lot of pieces have really great collections information, and some of the collectors, including the woman who collected these two baskets, took great field notes. And that's just so exciting, because when you read that, you can speak to someone like Terry Rothkar and ask her, and she was also very intrigued by what this fern was in this basket. And that's the same thing that the collector pointed out in her notes. So, so it's nice to see those connections across time. And then also, for me, one of the best parts about my job, not just working at a museum, but as someone who's interested in things at the museum, as someone who's interested in things in the world, is when you have the opportunity to reach out to someone else and you kind of share that excitement about things, and you respect and appreciate their knowledge and honor their knowledge and their experience by asking them those questions. So these museum objects not only connect to you when you look at them closely, but they're an opportunity to connect to other people and to connect to people that might be geographically far away. I think for students and teachers that are interested in looking at historic objects and objects in museum collections, I think now is a really great time to do that kind of exploration, because there are a lot of really great resources out there. There's a few ones to avoid, and we'll talk about that. But I think there are a lot of great online resources, and there are a lot of not so great online resources to avoid. So I think what's important is to look at, okay, where does this website come from? You know, who was involved in the information being provided? Because a lot of time you'll get second, third, fourth-hand information, and sometimes people like to romanticize or generalize, and you don't really want to go in that direction. So I think a good starting point is to go to museum websites, and you can look to see if those museums have collections from the region you're interested in, and they'll probably provide general information. They might have also done exhibits on those kinds of objects, and then you can find exhibition catalogs, you know, in the last 10 or maybe 20 years, that'll be good sources of information. There's also some classic books that are out there, and once you start reading those more recent publications, you'll be able to see those references and know good resources to go to. And then there are also online resources available in terms of databases of objects that have information. And where I work, for example, at the Arctic Studies Center, we have an exhibit catalog, and the essays in there are all written by Alaska Native people from the communities that are being discussed. And that's a really good indicator, is when information includes that sort of firsthand information, even if something's been written in the past, because there are some good publications that were based on research done in the mid-1800s up to the early 1900s. And they're giving you firsthand information, either that they observed while they were in that community, and that's a good marker, or oral traditions that have been written down, or things that they've recorded and transcribed. Those are really good. And those are out there for a lot of places. We also have a museum exhibition website called Sharing Knowledge, and on that site we provide some general information that's been summarized, but then we also have information provided by Alaska Native elders and culture bearers that we worked with. And so I think all those are really good starting points for sifting out where you should go to look for things. You definitely want to see that people are either experts in that field, so anthropologists and archaeologists or ethnologists, and to see where they're affiliated with. Are they affiliated with a university or a museum? Those are really good indicators of well-presented information. And the kinds of things that you should avoid, we talked a little bit about of those sort of general websites where people are copying and pasting information in and that sort of thing. But also some of the older publications that are either written by collectors or based on collectors' collections. So again, that's sort of removed from the immediate information. And those often are just too generalized. And things maybe published in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, if they aren't those sort of firsthand accounts of people that were in the community, they might be people who have never been there, that have never looked at firsthand resources. They might just be writing about things they're looking at in a general way. And you kind of want to avoid that, because today we have all these great opportunities to get towards that more firsthand information, and with that goal of letting Alaska Native peoples or indigenous peoples speak for themselves, speak about their own cultures. I think when you try to generalize about indigenous peoples, sometimes that's based on geography, sometimes that's done because there's so little time and so much ground to cover. Some of that can be based on past ideas of cultures being similar enough that you can generalize. But I think what's really important is, instead of trying to cover a large area or cover a lot of different indigenous groups, I think it's important to look closely at one or two of them, because it's really about the quality of the information that you can share. And for example, in terms of language is a good example. The word Eskimo is still out there, and we don't use that term. And to some extent, some people find it pejorative, because some of the things thought about where that word actually came from is a sort of anglicized variation of an indigenous word for eaters of raw meat. And but beyond that, it's just a general word, and you don't know really who they're talking about. They could be talking about Canadian Inuit, Inupiaq, and Inupiaq's Northwest Alaska. They could be talking about Yupik people, that's Southwest Alaska. They're really far away from each other geographically. It could be talking about Sukpiaq people. Well, they're out on islands, and St. Lawrence Island is out on another island. These are different cultures with different languages, and they might share some things. Like you can see in collections here, they might share similar looking harpoon heads, or the use of ulus, which is a stone or slate, and in a contemporary context, a metal bladed knife. They might share some of those things, but they all have different cultures. They have, like, as I said, they have different languages, and even logically, they live in different environments. They might all be Arctic, but they live in different places, so the knowledge that they have is different, and some of their practices are different. And I think it's really important to recognize how unique cultures are and the specialized knowledge that they have. And it just makes more interesting to look at fewer places more closely, because that's just, the richness is in the details. The richness is in the connections within a culture. And it's sometimes nice to compare another culture to that, because sometimes through comparison, it really helps you look closely at things. So yeah, I think it is important to not generalize. And one thing I'd like to add in terms of studying Alaska Native cultures or studying indigenous cultures in general, we've talked a little bit about how in the past there has been difficulties, people have been colonized and displaced and diseases were brought in, and all of those things are important things to know about the past that we can do better in the present and future. But it's really great to know that when you do things respectfully and at that not generalized level, it can be really rewarding, and that Alaska Native people, appreciate that people appreciate their culture and their accomplishments in the past and in the present, and that when you study these cultures and learn about these peoples, you're honoring them, and you're indicating that you appreciate what they've done and what they've accomplished, and that they have something to learn from. And that's a really nice thing to do, and that's a really respectful thing to do. So I wouldn't let anything get in your way of doing that. If it might seem daunting, just get specific. If it seems like there's too much information, just choose certain subjects to look at, certain types of objects to look at. But I would generally just say it's a really rewarding thing to do, to look at historic objects in museum collections.